What's up, gamers? Coming at you live with my new hottest FE6 fixes and upgrades. Because this game is stinky doo-doo, and only I, Blorp Blorp, am worthy of fixing it. Our first contestant is Roy. Remember him from the hit game Smash Brothers? Yeah. Roy gets +5 to every stat and starts with an A support with Cecilia, because she's totally banging, am I right, Gamerphiles? He also starts with the Binding Blade, which now has 100 critical, and grants him an extra action each time he uses it. Now moving on to Walt, who's received +5 to his luck growth. Even though it's the most recent game in the series to remain unlocalized, FE6 continues to be the game that people attempt to fix the most often. Especially in the most recent years, it feels like every other week someone comes up with a new genius idea to somehow repair a game that didn't even need repairing in the first place. Am I saying FE6 is perfect? No. It's got plenty of flaws in areas like unit balance, questionable map design, ambush spawns, and literally only having a single objective to complete throughout the entire game, as though we're still savages playing original Shadow Dragon. But regardless of its flaws, I think the way to improve it is through very gradual changes, rather than bonking half of the player units with the Gale Force Hammer and adding playable Lin for no reason. Please stop doing this, I'm so sick of her stupid face. That inane rant aside, we're still going to be talking about the absolute worst units in Binding Blade, of which there are definitely plenty of options. In fact, there are so many options that I was tempted to split this into 2 separate videos. But for brevity's sake, we're just going to be sticking to a selection of 8 units, same as last time. Although, compared to FE7, I wouldn't actually say that these units in particular are the bottom 8 of their respective games, so to say. And if you're wondering why Walt wasn't included in this list, it's because he's perfect and will not be receiving any improvements, as the universe wouldn't be able to handle the magnitude of his girth. Furthermore, another aspect that separates FE7 and 6 in terms of balancing is that FE6 falls less into FE7's failings, where units are outclassed by pre-promotes, and more just has a wide variety of units that are borderline unusable, usually due to a combination of their base stats rivaling dancers and their join time being absolutely laughable. Listen, I'm not gonna point and laugh at any of the Wendy fans in the audience, but just know that your taste in spunky pink-haired tomboys is immaculate, but your choice in viable units could certainly use some work. Same rules as last time, meaning that these characters will be placed randomly into either C, B, or A tier on a pretty vague and nebulous Binding Blade tier list. Specifically for hard mode, as a lot of these units on normal mode are perfectly viable. With all of that said, let's begin with the earliest joining stinker, that being the Ostian Knight, Boars. Boars is an anomaly of a unit. There's really no other way to put it. He's an armor knight joining from chapter 1 onwards, which doesn't have to mean that he's automatically terrible, as there's other units who fall into a similar category and prove to be useful in their own right. Which is something I really wish I could say for Ostia's bravest boy, as green-haired Gary over here has a litany of different issues. Boasting some pretty piss-poor bases, mediocre growths, and arguably the weakest class in the game, it's not an exaggeration to say that Boars' only role in chapter 1 is to go and beg for money at the local village while everyone else does the actual fighting. In fact, to really put it into perspective, aside from Roy, who we're going to be avoiding talking about, Boars is the only unit in chapter 1 who can't immediately engage in combat on turn 1, meaning that you're actually going to have to wait a turn to see how truly whelming this unit's combat prowess is. Now, unlike a lot of other characters, I felt as though Boars didn't really fit into any particular niche. He isn't amazingly strong from the get-go like Marcus, but he doesn't really feel like he should fall into the same category as your other level 1 units, since he's cursed with the Unholy 4 movement. So, I decided that the best course of action would be to transform Boars into a Deke-esque unit. And yes, this sentence is in the script so I can make the Deke and Boars joke. This means that Boars has received a rather significant boost to his bases, acquiring +5 HP, +3 strength, +5 skill, and +3 speed, as well as gaining 3 extra levels to help him get closer to promotion. These improvements will transform Boars' combat capability from being very unimpressive to something resembling an acceptable forecast. Sure, he won't be doubling anything right away, and I wouldn't want him to anyway, as I've also done some rearranging with his growths. It's no secret that all 3 armor knights are present on this list, and I won't spoil what Wendy or Barthe's changes are yet, but know that I've tried to diversify the changes with each specific knight, turning them all into something that feels unique to use. In Boars' case, he's gained 10% to his skill and speed growths, whilst losing a pretty minor 5% of his defense growth, turning him into a unit that is focused on becoming more deadly in combat through speed, rather than bulkier through defense. Again, Boars doesn't really follow the traditional guidelines in that he basically has no niche, so instead of trying to fit him into the role of your standard armor knight, I decided to expand upon his peculiar nature even further, making him the oddly speedy one of the trio. He's still not that impressive at base, but the increase to his level and potential chance of doubling should assist him greatly should the player decide to use him for something other than visiting villages. Shout out to the Boars in my Iron Rando, by the way. Turns out when you double a unit's movement and improve all their bases by 5 points, they become stupid good. Still can't believe he survived all the way to the end. Wait, shit, that's spoilers, cut the feed! Oh man, Binding Blade really has some stinkers for units, huh? Dorothy isn't good, in any sense of the word. Similar to Boars, her best features are mediocre and her worst features render her one of the weakest units in the entire game. With outlandishly feeble bases for a unit joining from Chapter 6, along with being stuck on the only other class in the game that's in contention for being the worst, Archer. Due to having the same base strength and actually lower base speed than Roy, Dorothy is pretty much incapable of offering anything valuable in her joining chapter, perhaps outside of locking Kath in the stupid idiot corner. She needs help, and lots of it if she's going to move up 4 tiers, so I decided to buff her in a way so that her new form would match her description, that of a bodyguard. Dorothy joins with Saul with the intent to protect him from harm, but her defense is only 2 points higher, and her health is actually lower. To remedy this mismatch of stats and professions, Dorothy has received some heavy buffs to her strength, HP, and defense, along with some minor buffs to her skill, speed, and luck, as well as +2 constitution, because it just felt correct. These changes were to shift Dorothy into the hard-hitting archer, giving her genuinely formidable offense from the moment she joins, in addition to commendable bulk with an effective health of 34, turning her from a frail archer into a remarkably tanky bodyguard. This boost to her power will also transfer effectively into the very next chapter, that being the infamous Revolt in Ostia, widely regarded to be the toughest chapter in the game, with the primary reason being the first appearance of Wyvern Riders, who boast dummy high stats along with ludicrous mobility. With new Dorothy, however, the player will now have a safety net, as she'll be able to deal significant damage to these scaly bastards, while still being tanky enough to survive on enemy phase, albeit with no counterattack damage because archers were simply too polite until they discovered the words close and counter. Finally, she's received one minor change to her support with Saul, upping their starting support points from 20 to 45 and increasing their growth from +2 per turn to +3, allowing them to reach C support within 5 turns. I think. I'm gonna be real, FE6 supports are non-Euclidean in nature, and not even the greatest historians can figure them out properly. But this is mostly a quality of life buff more than anything. These two have been traveling together for at least a few chapters. They should have a faster support. Looking over these changes, I'm actually wondering if I went a little bit overboard. Vanilla Dorothy is undoubtedly one of the most disappointing units in the entire game, but these buffs effectively fix all of her underlying issues, outside of the fact that she probably still won't be doubling anything. I've always had a soft spot for crappy archers, so it could just be blatant favoritism, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Still inferior to Walt though, obviously, since Dorothy didn't get to grasp from the sweet teat of Rebecca's fire support bosom. Oh man, I'm not changing that. That's it, that's the Dorothy section, everyone. Alright, moving on to the next character. Would you believe me if I told you that placing this mistake of a character into C tier was actually the hardest one of these? It's relatively simple to raise a character up to A tier, or do the reverse of slamming them down into D tier, which we will be doing at some point, stay tuned for potential content! But threading the needle and getting Sophia into a comfortable position where she's both not too powerful but also still viable?
That is hard.
Obviously, yeah, Sophia is pretty much the textbook definition of a terrible unit. Her bases are all single digit, her join time is comical, and her growths aren't even good to the point where you could justifiably call her an est. I called Boars a beggar and Dorothy a bouncer, so it isn't too inaccurate to call Sophia Deagle because all she does is find the ring and then get murdered by Andy Serkis. That's me, I'm Andy Serkis. So, in regards to fixing this abomination, I decided that making her an average character for the entire game would be extremely difficult. So the changes she's received were done mostly to improve her performance in Chapter 14, Arcadia. This means that while her growths remain totally unchanged, Sophia has been given boosts to her HP, magic, skill, defense, as well as a ludicrous +7 speed. This might seem pretty significant, But honestly, Sophia's stats were actually just that garbage before these buffs, so she's still not even that formidable. Now, I haven't done the math exactly because that's boring and I could be looking at jingling keys, but the improvements to her speed and bulk should generally mean that she is far less likely to get slaughtered by literally every single enemy in Arcadia. Furthermore, she's received one last buff in a slightly peculiar form, in that I gave her increased vision in Fog of War to match that of a thief. Now, in doing this, I also had the ingenious idea to give her the ability to use lockpicks, and definitely not because it was a package deal that came with FE Builder. Fuck it, she's a thief mage now. Thief mage. This one was weird. I wasn't fully intending for Sophia to transition into some unholy fusion of thief and shaman, but honestly, I kinda dig it. It gives her something unique, and actually adds a quality to her identity that isn't just being that unit that everyone tolerates until they get their precious guiding ring. Does this make her any better than any of the existing thieves? Who knows? But at least now she'll be capable of doing something other than just becoming a stain on someone else's weapon. There's a unit called Oujay? Show me a picture of him, you're making this up. I literally have no idea. Well, wait a minute. Is that Hero's art? When the fuck did they add Oujay? Oh, Jay. Who else did they add with this update? Sweet mother of mercy! Oujay, in my perfectly expert opinion, is the most forgettable unit in the entirety of Binding Blade. Honestly, maybe the entire series for a variety of different reasons. Obviously, joining with the other members of the notorious Scrub Squad certainly doesn't help, but the garish deep blue hair and the rotting banana yellow vest certainly don't make his design seem any more appealing. Moreover, Barthe and Wendy are also far more memorable due to how comically awful they are, whilst Oujay doesn't quite meet the same mark. His stats aren't anything to write home about, but they're perfectly usable. Plus his growths and class are actually both pretty decent. So why then is this seemingly average unit on this list to begin with? Yeah, Deke is pretty much everything that Oujay would ever aspire to be, boasting great bases, acceptable growths, and a higher than average level as well, meaning that he's most likely to receive that first hero crest. Okay, second hero crest. Point being, as long as Deke exists, there's no real reason to invest into Oujay, as the majority of times Deke will simply turn out stronger and have significantly better availability to boot. So, getting Oujay into the same tier as his Deke ship would be fairly difficult without performing some drastic changes. Take a trip with me over to the Fire Emblem wiki and get a nice close look at Oujay's bio. You see that? Where it says Little Hero? We've found the answer, ladies and gentlemen. Instead of trying to fix Mercenary Oujay, I will instead be giving him a free promotion into Hero, with a few caveats. These improvements to his class and bases will make his combat seem significantly stronger right away, which will also be helped by another alteration I made, that being to his growths. Despite now being a pre-promote, Oujay has received buffs to his skill, speed, and luck growths, making him seem much more appealing to the average player. Now, with all of these changes, it might seem like I've made a weird mishmash of a unit, but my goal with this dingaling was to make it seem as though he rushed into being a promoted unit too quickly, promoting it around, say, level 10-11, causing his stats to become somewhat unimpressive for a tier 2 unit, while still having the benefits of being a hero at the very least. The non-pre-promote growths are to support this idea, and while certainly not standard, I actually really like the idea of an inexperienced pre-promote having the stats to represent that. I had to give this blue-haired mannequin some form of character, and at the end of the day, I think that's Oujay. Ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum. In a way, we're descending in quality as we make our way through the Scrub Squad, with the next one on the conveyor belt of utter disappointment being none other than Barthe. Barthe is an extremely simple unit, or at the very least he should be, fitting into the role of the traditional Armor Knight with strong HP, strength, and defense, whilst lacking in mobility, and making Roy seem like the fucking Flash in comparison. Huh? Unfortunately, while his defense is pretty decent for this part of the game, Barthe's remaining stats are just pathetic to look at, with his only other redeeming feature being his monstrous 16 constitution, which isn't going to amount to anything unless you really want Barthe to rescue Bartchery in order to form the unstoppable Baba! Along with his growths not doing much to fix his weaker stats, also he's the only unit in all of FE to have a resistance growth of 2! It's no surprise that Barthe doesn't really do anything outside of maybe take a couple of hits here and there. His fixes are exceedingly simple, however. All I've done is improve his bases in the areas where he's supposed to be excelling, that being strength, skill, and HP. As well as +3 luck, because that's my go-to band-aid fix. +7 skill will help Barthe with its previously shoddy hit chances against the majority of enemies, and 13 strength will give him a chance to do some reasonably chunky damage with his starting steel lance, which isn't his only weapon now either. The other buff that I bestowed upon Barthe was to his weapon rank, now starting at B instead of C, allowing him to use weapons like the spear at base. And oh wow, would you look at that, he now starts with one in his inventory.
How'd that get in there?
Allowing him to aid the army either by being one of the few units who's capable of using a fairly accurate 1-2 range lance, or by giving it to units like Marcus and Zealot who could also utilize it perfectly well. Overall, he's still pretty much the same unit, but now he'll potentially have something to do in Chapter 8 as opposed to just awkwardly lagging behind the rest of your army like a lost puppy. While he does have a niche through being one of the few units who can use his newly acquired spear, he may not be worthy of a deployment slot for very long, but at least he'll be a formidable bulwark who can choke a point just like Dogo would have wanted. Just make sure the enemy doesn't beat him to death with hammers, because it won't end well. I'm not calling her Gwendolyn.
Not this time.
You'll pry the name Wendy from my cold, dead hands. Anyway, Wendy is terrible in pretty much... no, yeah, literally every single aspect. She has the worst class in the game, unusable bases, and while her growths are decent, they're not 200% in every area, so it doesn't make up for the fact that she gets doubled by almost every enemy in her joining chapter, a feat that not even Barthe and Oujay are capable of proudly proclaiming. So, getting her into A tier without making her completely busted was an ordeal to say the least. Nevertheless, in order to match the trio of Armor Knights, with Bors being the fast one and Barthe being the strong one, I decided that turning Wendy into the all-rounder who can do a little bit of everything would be the best course of action. For starters, literally all of Wendy's stats have been improved, with general increases across the board. And let's be real, even with these boosts, her stats still aren't very good. Furthermore, I've left them in a pretty middling state because I also buffed her growths, and not just by a minimal amount either. Before any changes, Wendy was supposed to be a growth unit, despite having basically 40s in most areas, which really isn't high enough to warrant using her in the long term. To remedy this, she's received +5% to luck and defense, +10% to strength and skill, as well as a whopping 20% to resistance, causing her growth total to go from an okay 290 to a ludicrous 340, placing her as one of the game's strongest growth-based characters. Ignoring Corel, obviously, because he doesn't fucking count. And if both of these changes weren't enough, this final change will certainly push her into reasonable viability. In order for her to be truly set apart from the other available armored units in Binding Blade, I decided to give the female version of the class +1 movement overall, meaning that she now has 5 movement at base and 6 when promoted. Now, to the purists out there, this probably seems like the most horrific thing ever. But we've seen Armor Knights have the same movement as other infantry units in games like Engage, and it didn't destroy the balance in the slightest. Consider this an experiment to see if giving this upside-down tortoise of a unit an extra point of move will let her contend with the other Goliaths. In retrospect, it's a little strange for me to turn Wendy into the growth unit instead of Sophia, but I guess the random ranks just kinda made it turn out that way. Perhaps in another universe, another version of this video, Sophia will be getting her perfectly ultimate great form while Wendy will be left crying in the dirt. But we're not living in that universe. We're firmly in the Wendy now has 5 movement and is rapidly approaching your location as I distract you. It's too late, she's already there. Geese is a unit that I absolutely adore. Is what I would say if the unit actually accomplished anything other than handing me the Brave Axe and then sitting down for 20 odd chapters. Furthermore, I feel like Geese actually falls under what I like to call the Kaiser effect, where a unit is considered to be okay simply because there are weaker units available. In order to prove that Geese is on the precipice of being considered a dumpster tier unit, we'll be using Gonzalez, a character who has very clear and heavy weaknesses that are also paired with genuine strengths. On the other hand, Geese is more of an all-rounder type unit, presenting decent stats in most areas, with the issue being that they simply aren't decent enough. He isn't hitting hard enough, he won't double anything, and maybe the most damning thing against him is the fact that he has to use FE6 axes as his only form of weaponry.
Nothing about this is good.
With all of these factors combined, you're left with the unit of all time, whose only redeeming feature is that he can walk on water. Extremely slowly. with no benefit. My goal for getting Geese into the same tier as Gonzi was to make him feel like he's capable of completing tasks that Gonzalez would otherwise be unable to do. For starters, I've improved almost all of Geese's base stats, mostly in an attempt to emulate hard mode bonuses, because balancing around those made this video require significantly more drugs.
Don't look at me like that. I'm nice and strong.
Fuck, I missed. But it was also just to put him on par with your other units. However, the main area where I decided to change Geese entirely was his skill, giving him a 7-point boost to his mediocre base, giving him incredibly reliable hit chances, especially in comparison to his other Berserker bro. This will hopefully offset the fact that most axes are packing 60 hit in a dream, which I also altered ever so slightly. I'm not fixing the hit rates of every single axe because that would both fundamentally change the game and require far more effort, but I decided to give the Brave Axe an additional 10 hit, because that thing having only 55 hit in vanilla was difficult to look at. Moreover, while none of the other axes have received any buffs, I changed B-Route Geese's starting inventory from having a Steel Axe to having a Killer Axe, which will pair far more favourably with his now reasonably commendable crit chances. In retrospect, giving this character that large of a buff to a singular stat may have been slightly overkill, but it almost feels necessary. Geese, at least to me, was just another one of those units that you'd only use if you really liked their aesthetic or personality, similar to Oujay. And while that is a perfectly valid reason to use a unit, I wanted to give him something that set him apart from the otherwise superior Berserkers, as he's just so forgettable otherwise. I suppose only time will tell whether these boosts were too much or not, but at the very least, I'm glad Geese will actually be strong enough to perform without heavy booster investment. Try not to leave him near any ledges though.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey, Billy.
And at last, we return to the progenitor of all things disappointing, that being Lady Lilina herself. Similar to the finale of the last video, Lilina falls into the same category as Lyn, in that there's a wide variety of people who believe this character to be perfectly good, primarily due to their reasonable normal mode performance. This, combined with the fact that she has vague story importance and relation to Hector, is enough for me to only make some minor adjustments. Is what I would say if I wasn't based and loop-hilled! Real talk though, Lilina is probably the best unit present on this list, but it's not exactly high praise. Along with joining effectively at the same time as the Scrub Squad, Lilina appears both underleveled and with extremely underwhelming bases, giving the player a unit who is both exceedingly frail and likely to get doubled by everything. And while she does actually have some reasonably decent growths to compensate for this, it's an uphill battle as she'll also be competing for a guiding ring with other units such as Sol, Clarine, and Lou, who both have better availability and, you know, actually have a speed growth. So, remember at the start of the video how I said we're going to be making small gradual changes to balance these characters? Yeah, that's dumb and stupid, so I'm giving Lilina an overhaul.
Let's go!
To begin with, Lilina absolutely needs some improvements to her stats. So to help her keep up with the rest of your army, she's received plus 4 HP, plus 3 magic, plus 2 speed, and wouldn't you know it, plus 3 luck!
Please clap.
Moreover, I also did a little rearranging with her defense and resistance, causing her to lose 5 resistance, but in return receive an extra plus 5 defense, giving her some reasonable physical bulk. And if you're wondering why this child is now slightly more difficult to send to the Obliteration Realm, it's because she's Hector's daughter, and it feels weird that Hector's sperm could produce an offspring this flimsy. Maybe this means Hector X Lyn is canon, I don't know. And while the majority of her growths are unchanged, I effectively switched her defense and resistance growths, further encouraging the idea of an armored mage rather than the traditional one who is more resistant to magic. It's a surprisingly uncommon archetype in Fire Emblem, so I thought it would be fun to revisit it, and see if a bulky unit who targets resistance instead of defense is even remotely balanced. Lastly, I decided to improve Lilina's arsenal by altering the weapon she receives in Chapter 8 from a regular old Thunder Tome to a personal weapon. Yeah, I know, I don't like giving units personal weapons. I think that it's usually a really lazy way to make a unit strong that has no lasting impact once the weapon breaks. That being said, when done very infrequently, such as in Binding Blade where there's only 2 to begin with, I think adding just 1 more wouldn't be too much of a war crime. The Foudrex is effectively a head start for Lilina, acting as a way for her to catch up to the rest of the army whilst not being a permanent source of reliable damage throughout the entire game. You probably already noticed its main defining feature, that being its effective damage against pirates, brigands, and mercenaries. This selection of enemies may seem somewhat random, but when you take a look at the goobers that make up 90% of the red boys in the upcoming chapters, it makes a lot more sense. By giving Lilina a way to effectively just erase these enemies from the map entirely, it will allow her to secure a deployment slot over other mages, whilst still having a ticking clock element with her weapon's durability that prevents her from being outright superior. I really want to like Lilina, trust me, I really do. But her vanilla form absolutely wasn't doing her any favors. It always really bugs me when a character in FE is presented as a vital part of the story, but when it comes to their gameplay performance, they're getting outshined by a literal orphan who just decided to pick up a tome. With all of these massive changes to her kit, not only will she be significantly stronger, she'll actually feel unique, which is always an important trait to have in my opinion. With all that said though, let's not forget her most iconic characteristic, that being the honor of being the first notch on Archer Joey's bow.
Well, I'm dead.
Binding Blade is a weird game, man. It can have so many maps that are excellent spectacles of a large-scale war, and then it can immediately poop itself with the very next chapter. If you asked me whether the game is good or not, I'm not entirely sure what my answer would be. There's plenty of stuff that I like, but then again, Amber Spawns make me age rapidly every time they happen, so I really don't know whether it's actually a good game. That being said, every time I wonder this, I play through it again to find out, and I'm met with some reasonably interesting characters, a story that isn't offensively stupid, and Marcus's backpack, who just doesn't know when to quit. Yeah! I think the only way I could really finalize my opinion on FE6 is to have a definitive version. So please, Insys, ignore the pleas for the FE4 remake and remake Binding Blade instead, because I said so. Okay, so you're probably wondering where I went for 6 months. Long story short, I have myasthenia gravis, an autoimmune condition that effectively makes my muscles not work properly. Now, normally, medication allows me to live pretty peacefully, but due to some hiccups in medication changes, I've been relapsing for the past 5-ish months. Meaning that from December to around February, I stopped working on this video because my fingers and voice literally weren't strong enough. Now, I'm starting to feel a little better, so production has been slow, but I'm just glad the video is finally done. Hopefully, it was worth the wait. In regards to future videos and such, it's gonna be a while before the next one, and sorry, no stream highlights for the moment. Gonna be going dark again for a bit. Hopefully I didn't go on for too long there. Just know that I'll definitely make more stuff. I just don't know how long it's going to be before the next video. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for the 2K subs. That's absolutely fucking bananas. Thank you so much. Was not anticipating that, but genuinely, thank you guys. Alright, hope you enjoyed the video. I'll catch you next time.